A spring afternoon being described as a dark signals the apocalyptic feel alongside the dried-up North Sea. He also presents a unique, unordinary action that draws the reader in, cities chasing one another. This is essentially the premise that dictates the whole conflict of the story to come. It is an action scene, but unlike one we have ever seen before. The most persuasive opening lines are succinct, and not superfluous. To do this, it is often effective to limit it to a single central idea. 1984 chooses to set up its thematic question, while Mortal Engines sets up its setting. It can be tempting to bring in as many intriguing elements of your story as you can, but picking one central element for that opening line allows the author to narrow the reader's focus onto something that makes your story stand out. This does not need to be the most important element, but it should be a central element that is interesting. In Stephen King's The Gunslinger, he opens with the following. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. This introduces the conflict between his protagonist and antagonist. For the record, when I use the term opening line, this can include the first paragraph also. The same rules apply. Cornelia Funke's Inkheart takes 2 paragraphs to establish her central idea that books are magical. The difficulty in writing an opening line that has shock factor, intrigue, and intimately reflects the tone and ideals behind your story makes it tempting to write these bizarre openers that don't actually set up the story. One example of this can be seen in the opening to the 2007 Doctor Who episode, Doomsday, where Rose Tyler says, "This is the story of how I died." The problem with this opening line is that it sets up a central point of tension that never eventuates in a meaningful way. The reader is left feeling cheated because Rose Tyler never dies, she is just transported to an alternate world, and is recorded among the dead of her homeworld. That opening line then feels more like clickbait, read this book to find out how she died. Exaggerating a story element to make it more intriguing for the opening line creates an unsatisfactory experience for the reader when the reality is revealed, either falsely building tension or creating a misleading basis for your story. Tone. Ellen Brock, an editor who has spoken a lot about writing herself, noted that the best thing you can do for your book is to make sure the first chapter adequately represents the tone of the rest of the chapters, so the book as a whole seems cohesive. In John Green's The Fault in Our Stars, the opening chapter introduces the feeling of death hanging over Hazel Grace's head, but it's written in a relatively funny and cynical way. The reader knows from the first chapter that this is going to be a story that deals with heavy issues, setting a somber tone even if told with an amusing narrator. It matches the rest of the story. This does not mean that if you have a tragic twist later on, you cannot have a happy beginning in the first chapter. Twists are often accompanied by drastic changes in tone. However, it does mean that it can be jarring for the reader if the opening problem we discussed before is what should be a traumatic experience, but then chapter 2 is upbeat and comedic. There is an immediate inconsistency in tone that leaves the reader wondering what this book is trying to be. This is partly why in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, the first chapter, which is more of a prologue, as discussed in Part I, skips the traumatic scene of depicting the death of Harry's parents, and goes straight to the celebrations of Voldemort's fall, and the whimsical Dumbledore, and the boisterous Hagrid. It's more consistent with the tone of the rest of the story. Though this part is not for discussing tone, we can touch on it. It can be built in any number of ways, including 1. Imagery. Focusing on how the wind and rain is tearing the leaves off trees establishes a pessimistic tone, while focusing on how a single beautiful flower survives the storm establishes an optimistic tone. 2. Stakes of the opening problem. In the opening scene of Shakespeare's King Lear, the problem Cordelia faces is the need to prove how much she loves her father, the king. Everything in her inheritance is at stake here, establishing a more serious tone to the story as one of Shakespeare's tragedies. Fundamentally, tone is less about what happens and more about how you say it. It is about the feelings you invoke in the reader with imagery, diction, characterization, and emphasis. The tone of the opening chapter is generally best received when it somewhat reflects the tone of the rest of the story. The opening hook. A common misunderstanding about the first chapter is conflating the inciting incident with the hook. The inciting incident is the thing that launches your character into their quest, whatever it is. The hook, on the other hand, is the very first moment in your story that intrigues your reader and makes them want to know more. A great example of this is in Avatar, The Last Airbender. The inciting incident is Sokka and Katara chancing across the frozen Avatar, Aang. This is the event that draws the protagonistic and antagonistic forces together to generate conflict. Some have suggested the hook is when Katara first uses waterbending, an intriguing moment, but it is actually earlier than that. It is the moment in the opening narration where Katara explains that, when the world needed the Avatar most, he vanished. Immediately, the viewer is asking, why did the avatar vanish, and where did they go? The answer to this is given partially in the inciting incident and partially in episodes that follow. Most of the time, the hook does one of two things. 1. It causes the reader to ask a question that they wish to know more about. 2. It sets up a controversial statement that they may or may not agree with. Avatar, The Last Airbender, is an example of the former. The most famous example of the latter is Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, where she writes, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a young man in possession of a large fortune must be in want of a wife. It should be noted that not every first chapter needs an inciting incident. They often have them, but inciting incidents also often happen in the second or third chapters. They do, however, need a hook to operate as an enticing first chapter. Beyond this, I wish to be clear, there are an infinite number of things that we could discuss in how to write the first chapter, as the first chapter can be done in an infinite number of ways. Most writers know that they have to introduce characters, set tone, build setting, and so on. But that advice is not all that helpful unless you learn how to do those things. This was a close look at some essential, often overlooked, elements of the first chapter. Summary. 1. Firstly, using the mini 3-act structure gives you the opportunity to introduce your setting and characters in interesting ways as you show what kind of problems arise in your world and how your character approaches them. 2. Secondly, effective opening lines tend to be succinct and not superfluous. To do this, introduce only one central element of your story that makes it interesting, the conflict, the setting, the theme, or otherwise. However, don't exaggerate these ideas to appear extraordinary and interesting for effect only to reveal them as ordinary later on. 3. Thirdly, first chapters tend to work when their tone is consistent with the rest of the story. This can be done with stakes, imagery, diction, emphasis, and many other tools. 4. Fourthly, the hook and inciting incident are two different story elements. A first chapter must have a hook. This usually takes the form of a question or a statement of eternal principle. Part 3. The Exposition Problem. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.A. Rowling, The Mortal Instruments by Cassandra Clare, The Matrix by the Wachowskis, Inception by Christopher Nolan, Artemis Fowl by Owen Colfer, Save the Cat by Blake Snyder, Leviathan Wakes by James S. A. Corey, Runaround by Isaac Asimov, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, Star Wars, The Phantom Menace by George Lucas, Avatar, The Last Airbender by Michael D. Martino and Brian Konietzko, Mortal Engines by Philip Reeve, Atonement, screenplay by Christopher Hampton and directed by Joe Wright, A Storm of Swords by G.R. Martin, Interstellar by Christopher Nolan and Jonathan Nolan. Delivering exposition is like expressing that you love your sibling at their wedding, difficult, but necessary. Welcome to a long chapter on exposition, because apparently I couldn't figure out a way to deliver important information concisely and interestingly enough. At its heart, exposition is the contextual information required to understand the story. This can be backstory of the characters, how your magic system works, how your antagonist rose to power, how the major pieces of technology in your science fiction world work, how your state is ruled by super intelligent lemmings, how your city-state has an economy based on pumpkins, or almost anything else. For example, in the Wachowskis' The Matrix, Neo and Morpheus sit down, and we get this scene. The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us, even now in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window, or when you turn on your television. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. In perhaps the most criminal example of bad advice you'll often hear, it is not uncommon to be told that exposition is bad writing. To be clear, this is not true. Exposition is important and useful information that helps the reader understand the story and the world you have built. The exposition problem, as we shall call it, is that exposition is difficult to make logical, interesting, memorable, and believable in the context of the story. What matters is how you communicate it. With this in mind, we can split delivering exposition into 3 questions. 1. How do you communicate exposition? 2. What information might you communicate? 3. When might you communicate it? In this endeavor, we will discuss the perspective character, narrative payoff, the Pope in the pool, characterization, conflict, environmental storytelling, problem-solving exposition, motivational exposition, respecting your audience, intrigue versus relatability, plot twists, the first chapter, and multiple characters. How to communicate exposition, the perspective character. One of the big parts of the exposition problem is that half the time, the information you are giving is something the reader does not know but all of the characters already do. For example, in Cassandra Clare's The Mortal Instruments, there is a peculiar scene with some demon hunters, a demon, and the main character, Clary, all in a room. Except, Clary is hiding, so no one else knows she is there. Yet, we get this line. Demons, said Jace. Religiously defined as hell's denizens, the servants of Satan, but understood here, for the purposes of the clave, to be any malevolent spirit whose origins is outside our own home dimension. This exchange is awkward at best. None of the characters in the room would say this because all of them knew it except Clary, who nobody knew was there. This textbook piece of exposition only serves to inform the reader, and nobody else. The book even acknowledges how clumsy this was in the next line, saying, yeah, nobody needs a lesson in semantics, mate. Because of this, one of the most common ways to solve the exposition problem is to use an unknowledgeable perspective character. This is a character who knows nothing of the magic, technology, or world that you have built, and so, just like the reader, needs everything explained to them in the simplest of terms. Think Aragorn, Ariadne in Inception, Pug in Magician, Harry Potter, Luke Skywalker, Frodo Baggins, or virtually any other fantasy or science fiction world we loved pretending we were in when we were 12 years old. The unknowledgeable perspective character gives a logical reason for the exposition to be communicated to the main character, and it is an easy way to inform the reader, because they would likely ask the same questions the reader would. However, this doesn't wholly solve the exposition problem. It is one way to introduce it logically, but that does not make it interesting or memorable. And this does not mean you need an unknowledgeable perspective character. In fact, it is probably one of the easiest ways to have exposition delivery appear lazy. But let's talk about an excellent example of the unknowledgeable perspective character, the character of Aang in Avatar, The Last Airbender. A major piece of exposition for the series is that 100 years ago, the Fire Nation committed genocide. They wiped out an entire people group known as the Air Nomads, of which Aang is the only surviving member. For the purposes of delivery, Aang is the unknowledgeable perspective character. Before it happened, he sealed himself in ice. In the episode The Southern Air Temple, Katara has to logically explain it to him. However, the writers frame it in a really interesting way. Throughout the episode, Katara suggests multiple times that Aang might need to think about the idea that maybe his people are gone, but he refuses to believe it. He insists instead that they are out there, perhaps hiding, right up until he finds the skeleton of his old friend, Gyatso. In seeing this, he is consumed with grief and rage and nearly kills his friends by accident. This exposition delivery is not just logical, but memorable and interesting, because the real focus is on Aang's trauma and not the exposition itself. There are consequences to that exposition being delivered. Katara and Sokka disagree on whether they should tell him. Aang faces a personal conflict in being confronted with the information. If that information were delivered to any other character, the story would have played out very differently. Using an unknowledgeable perspective character who is personally affected by learning the exposition helps the reader care about this information. Exploring the emotional consequences of them learning this means the character doesn't feel just like a blank slate stand-in for the reader, and it means the delivery is not just logical, but memorable and interesting, because who it is delivered to actually affects the story. One of the common lazier forms of the unknowledgeable perspective character is amnesia, where the main character, who should already know said exposition, conveniently forgets every relevant piece of information. It happens in Rick Riordan's Heroes of Olympus, James Dashner's The Maze Runner, and J.A. Sauder's The Elysium Chronicles. It is incredibly common in game sequels as a means to hold the hands of the player as they learn the ropes again, delivering bland exposition as to how you got like this, even if the reader or player actually already remembers. Now, amnesia is not necessarily a bad plot device, but it is very often used with no other consequences throughout the story. It is used as a means to communicate how the magic system works, but it does not affect the characters' interpersonal relationships in any meaningful way, such as how their girlfriend might feel when they realize their boyfriend does not remember them. But no. That might be a more interesting and realistic exploration of memory loss affecting a character, and we couldn't have that. How to communicate exposition, narrative payoff. Readers are curious creatures by nature, and you can work that to your advantage. This is a simple trick, make the reader work for it. It is difficult to make the reader want exposition if it is just thrown at them to grease the path of the main character into their adventure, explaining the world, and their place in it as the hero. In those circumstances, it is simply given to them without being earned. One way to circumvent this issue is to use the exposition as payoff in the narrative, by placing obstacles between it and the main character. A fantastic example of this is The Matrix. The mystery of what is the Matrix is set up from the opening scene, and Neo spends the first 30 minutes investigating and unraveling this curious mystery. He has to make a daring escape, he is interrogated by agents, and he has to have a tracker removed from him before he finally gets his answers. These obstacles mean that when Neo finally meets Morpheus, the exposition surrounding the Matrix feels more like a payoff to everything that has come before than a dry, unwanted delivery. At its heart, every mystery is simply a character on a quest for exposition. Placing obstacles in the narrative to get to the exposition helps the exposition feel more like a reward or payoff, because it sets up exposition as a goal in the narrative that both the character and the reader wish to reach. However, you might have already clued to the obvious problem with this strategy. This is a lot of setup for mere exposition. Because of this, the narrative payoff strategy primarily works for the most fundamental information to your story, that which is the unique premise of your novel, the first great twist, or the heart of the conflict. Then what is the Matrix? Question, in that sense. Obviously, not all exposition is fundamental enough to deserve this treatment. We would all be hideously underwhelmed to see Harry Potter fight his way through the Triwizard Tournament only to learn that Ragnak I was the original owner of Gorick Gryffinder's sword, something most readers neither care about nor is particularly relevant to the story. Additionally, the flip side of this is taking too long to get started. A third of a book is a long time for the audience to be patient while waiting for the world to make sense. How to communicate exposition, the Pope in the pool. As a writer, you are now left with other pieces of exposition that are neither made more interesting by impact on the characters or deserve to be framed in narrative payoff. Blake Snyder in Save the Cat, a great book for screenwriters, offers one solution, the Pope in the pool. This is where otherwise dull information is delivered in the context of a shocking, dramatic, or humorous scene. For example, the Pope being naked in a pool. Rather than focusing on the information relayed, we're thinking, I didn't know the Vatican had a pool. And look, the Pope's not wearing his Pope clothes, in his bathing suit. A great example of this is in Artemis Fowl by Owen Colfer. In the first chapter, Artemis confronts a fairy and demands their holy book. He explains, "You are a sprite, Pishog, fairy, Kaedelum. Whichever language you prefer to use. If you know about the book, then you know about the magic I have in my fist. I can kill you with a snap of my fingers." Artemis shrugged. "I think not. Look at you. You are near dead. The rice wine has dulled your senses." The reader comes to understand that there is a hidden magical world, it is full of creatures called sprites, and that fairies have a weakness to alcohol that dampens their magic. These are critical pieces of exposition that could be delivered in the most boring of ways, but instead, the focus for the reader is on this dramatic scene where the main character, Artemis, is essentially extorting and manipulating this weakened sprite into doing his bidding. The Pope in the pool is a way to distract the reader from the exposition and make it easier to digest. However, it is important to avoid making a scene shocking in a contrived or forced way. Weave it into a point in the story that already needs to be dramatic. But let us break the Pope in the pool technique down a little bit further into three categories: characterization, conflict, and environmental exposition. Characterization. One way to deliver exposition is to contextualize it as characterization. This is one of the reasons Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone's first few chapters are so well written. Giving a physical description of your character is difficult to make feel natural, but consider the following passage. Perhaps it had something to do with living in a dark cupboard, but Harry had always been small and skinny for his age. He looked even smaller and skinnier than he really was because all he had to wear were old clothes of Dudley's, and Dudley was about 4 times bigger than he was. Harry had a thin face, knobbly knees, black hair, and bright green eyes. He wore round glasses held together with a lot of scotch tape because of all the times Dudley had punched him on the nose. The only thing Harry liked about his own appearance was a very thin scar on his forehead that was shaped like a bolt of lightning. He had had it as long as he could remember, and the first question he could ever remember asking his Aunt Petunia was how he had gotten it. The only exposition given here is that which helps better explain the emotional state Harry is in, the setting, and how Harry was treated, with the exception of line C. 1. In line A, we learn Harry is not just a small and skinny, but that he was abused by being kept in a dark cupboard. 2. In line B, there is a sharp contrast to Dudley, indicative of how one of them is given everything, and the other is not, right down to how he got old clothes of Dudley's. 3. In line D, it is not his glasses that are described, but the reason his glasses are broken. Dudley bullies him. This exposition has an emotional dimension attached to it. 4. In line E, specifying that he only likes this weird scar tells us a lot about how Harry thinks about himself. He has low self-esteem. 5. Line therefore gives us a hint of his backstory, but it is couched in the description of the one thing he likes about himself, his scar. 6. Line C is simply a straight piece of exposition that tells us the shape of his face, his hair, and his eye color. However, when placed amongst the rest of the exposition, it is not lost. This is a strategy that G.R. Martin uses all the time. Throughout the A Song of Ice and Fire series, he constantly adds in little backstories to families, houses, and characters, but they work because they are always done in a way that reveals more about the character at hand. We essentially learn about the character through parable. In A Storm of Swords, Jaime Lannister reads through the great deeds of Sir Barristan Selmy in the White Book verbatim, but this detailed exposition is placed within the context of Jaime comparing himself to greater men, and coming to the demoralizing realization that he has no great deeds on record. Barristan Selmy's backstory exposition is delivered, but it is used to characterize Jaime. Conflict. A second pope in the Paul strategy is to phrase the exposition in a way that creates conflict. One example of this is in Leviathan Wakes by James S. A. Corey, where we find this passage. We'll get to the whole package. It'll be almost as good as the real thing. The inner planets have a new biogel that regrows the limb, but that isn't covered in our medical plan. Screw with the inners, and to screw with their magic jello. I'd rather have a good belter-built fake than anything they've grown in a lab. The exposition here is that two human societies have evolved, one on Earth, the jargon for them being called inners, and one on the asteroid belt, the jargon for them being belters. At the same time, we learn by proxy that there is a lot of tension between these two groups, which is somewhat characterized by the inners being more reliant on technology. This conflict is also symptomatic of the wider conflict that would soon envelop the solar system. Using conflict to deliver exposition can bring out the personal beliefs of the characters, depending on who explains it. It also allows the writer to naturally introduce colloquial terminology used in the story, and how that character phrases the conflict allows the author to explore how different factions are related. Environmental exposition. Most writers actually understand this piece of advice pretty well, because it is usually what is said when explaining the show, don't tell or rule, communicate exposition through your environmental descriptions. This is essentially information that can be derived, intuitively or through careful consideration, from the background. In the 2007 film Atonement, there is a 5-minute single-take tracking shot where we see horses being shot, the wounded being tended to, thousands of men on the beach, French civilians crying, soldiers praying and singing songs of hope to God, and the absolute ruin of a coastside town. This is essentially an expositional scene through which we understand that this is a war zone in World War II, the military forces are pressed against the beaches and desperately hoping to escape, they are running out of resources, and hope is dwindling. A smart viewer could probably deduce from that alone that this is Dunkirk, without a single word ever being uttered. Environmental exposition is also particularly effective in establishing world-building elements that do not naturally lend themselves to dialogue between the characters. We know in Bethesda's Fallout series that there has been a history of nuclear warfare from the wastes, the gas masks left around, and the ruins of cities. The reader will always infer things about your world when reading. And while other types of exposition are more explicit, such as telling the reader that the air nomad genocide happened, environmental exposition is more about what you want to let them wonder about. Things that are not vital to their comprehension of the story, but grounded in realism nonetheless. These are things that might be fascinating to you as the writer, but will not be as intrinsically interesting to the reader. We can infer from the opening scene in the 2006 film Children of Men, depicting an explosion in the streets of London and a dirty, crowded world, that this is a time of civil unrest and social decline. We are never told just how bad the world has gotten, but we can imagine what this world is like. Environmental exposition frames what the reader can infer from your story. Oftentimes, it is crucial in establishing a setting, tone, mood, or theme that would be jarring to explicitly state in the narrative. Of all the techniques, it is the one that requires the reader to think the most, and because of this, it is the most subtle. What information might you communicate? This is one thing that those who suffer from the addiction of world-building struggle with. The writers build elaborate, intricate, and wondrous worlds where they know the complex ins and outs of their magic, their politics, religions, economy, society, and everything else down to which rodent needs to be exterminated because they are eating too many pumpkins. With how much love and effort you put into all of this, it can be tempting to include everything because you want the reader to experience all of this fascinating stuff that you have put together. The problem is that not all of this is important or interesting to the reader, so it is critical to understand that not every part of your world building needs to be explicitly communicated. In Mortal Engines by Philip Reeve, the reader never gets an in-depth explanation of how the 60-minute war destroyed the world because, while it may an important part of the world building, it is not an important element of the narrative conflict. The question then becomes, what do we need to include? What information might you communicate? Problem-solving exposition. One type of necessary exposition is problem-solving exposition. This is the crucial information that will play a major role in the development or resolution of the conflict. If a character will do X to resolve the plot, then the reader needs to understand why that works within your world building. The clearest example of this is Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, introduced in his short story Runaround. These pertain to how artificial intelligence is programmed to act. 1. A robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. 2. A robot must obey orders given to it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. 3. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. The reader knowing these rules is critical to them understanding the development of the tension in the story, and it is also critical to understanding how that tension is resolved. In Runaround, the robot known as Speedy acts in accordance with the first law over the second and third laws. This principle also naturally applies to magic systems and science fiction technology. We will discuss this in much more depth in Part 9, Part X, and Part 11 on magic systems. It can be tempting to explain the complex magic system you have built down to the tiniest detail. It might be the amazing concept that makes your world unique, but in terms of the experience of the reader, the real question is this: does it help establish a sense of consistency in the narrative by making resolution to conflict more satisfying? In Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf's magic is not usually explained because it is not often used to solve problems, and where it is, it comes with a great cost. For example, the Fellowship loses Gandalf to the Balrog in the Fellowship of the Ring. Explaining that Gandalf is one of the 5 Astari, sent by the Valar to guide Middle-earth, endowed with a portion of divine power, such that he could draw on the fire powers of the Maya Aryan, who is the appointed guardian of the sun, would not actually create a more satisfying resolution to the obstacles the characters face in the story. In contrast, Brandon Sanderson spends pages of Mistborn just explaining his magic system, because it plays such a critical role in how the conflict is resolved in the narrative. It becomes necessary. Now let us take a look at an example of bad magic system exposition in Star Wars, The Phantom Menace. Qui-Gon Jinn explains to young Anakin, Qui-Gon, midichlorians are a microscopic lifeform that reside within all living cells. Anakin, they live inside of me. Qui-Gon, in your cells, yes, and we are symbionts with them. Anakin, symbionts. Qui-Gon, life forms living together for mutual advantage. Without the midichlorians, life could not exist, and we would have no knowledge of the Force. They continually speak to us, telling us the will of the Force. When you learn to quiet your mind, you will hear them speaking to you. Anakin, I don't understand. Qui-Gon, with time and training, Ani, you will. The problem here is that knowing this element of the magic system, the Force, does not help understand how problems are solved later on in the story. 3. This is also an example of the unknowledgeable perspective character we discussed before, who is meant to ask the questions that the reader or viewer is, but the problem here is that no viewer is asking this question. Sometimes, background world-building information is best used as knowledge the author can draw on when they need to in creating a consistent and complex world for the reader. What information might you communicate? Motivational exposition. It can be, but is not always, important to communicate information that explains why characters make the decisions that they do. This is most commonly because of backstory we do not see in the main narrative, such as past traumas or experiences that shift how the character sees the world. For example, in Avatar, The Last Airbender, we see flashbacks of Zuko's banishment that explain why hunting the Avatar is so important. Zuko sees it as the only way to redeem himself, regain his honor, and regain his father's affection. It also gives us insight into why he eventually chooses to help his crew members trapped in a storm in the episode The Storm, rather than pursue Aang, the Avatar. This piece of backstory exposition makes his choices understandable in the eyes of the viewer, and him as a character more relatable. Now the author might know the backstory of a character, but that does not mean the reader has to know it. Mysterious characters can fuel intrigue in the story,